Amazing. Hello, everyone. It's great to see you in this space. I hope you can hear me and see me. My name is Mavis. I use she, her pronouns. I hope they're coming through on my little box there. And I'm currently based in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. If you hear cockerels, I always say this in the background, that's kind of part of my setting. But for anyone who needs a visual description, I'm a Black, cisgender, female presenting person. I identify as queer, bisexual. I have Black Afro hair. I'm wearing a pair of clear glasses and wearing a mustard top and sitting in what looks like a birdcage, but is actually a chair. So if you don't know me, I'm the program director, We Create Space. And a little bit about us is that we are this, I guess I can only say that, awesome, but a global nonprofit platform, community and collective of queer change makers on the mission to improve the lives of LGBTQ plus people around the world. And we really do this by connecting our communities and our allies with tools, knowledge and support network for personal growth, self-care, queer leadership through shared experience in spaces like these. And if it's your first time, well, welcome. And for those who are returning to our sessions, it's so amazing to reconnect again over what I believe will be a really rich and insightful discussion. So we're here for Queer Perspectives, and this is essentially our monthly panel series where we bring together queer leaders who will share their stories and unique lived experience through their own LGBTQ plus and intersecting identities. And today we're exploring male privilege. So just framing it quickly, there will be two parts. So the panel in itself and then a Q&A. And across both of these, we really encourage you to share your thoughts and your questions using the chat. You can see some of you already in there introducing yourself. So please continue to do that. But as we go through as well, you can do that to bring forward whatever's on your mind, your reflections. And you also have the option of doing that in the Q&A function where you can share anonymously and direct your questions specifically towards the speaker. So without taking any more time, I'm going to hand over to Alex Leon, who's our amazing moderator today. So Alex will guide us through this session and also invite the others to introduce themselves. So over to you, Alex. Hey.
Thank you so much, Malis. A lovely introduction as always. So a big thanks to Malis and a big thanks to We Create Space for creating the space. Hey, it's in the name, great branding. So my name is Alex Lee and my pronouns are he, him, and a really quick introduction on me before I talk about this amazing topic and go over to our panelists. I am a writer, a speaker, and an international LGBTQ plus human rights activist and campaigner. I'm particularly interested in humanizing the intersection between race and ethnicity and being LGBTQ plus, and that's kind of what makes up the most of my work. I'm going to go over to our panelists in a second, but before I do, I wanted to, I guess, explore and introduce this topic a little bit. So the topic of today's panel is navigating male privilege. And male privilege, like all privileges, actually, is nuanced, right? We know that the experience of maleness is not monolithic. It is complex. It has many different shades, many different colors, and many different nuances. And so part of what we're doing today is trying to understand maleness and by extension, male privilege in context. We're trying to build a bit of context around what that term actually means and what it means for a diverse group of different queer people, some of which I have here on my panel today. So some of the kinds of questions we're going to be asking today are, within the population of people who self-identify as a man, does everyone benefit from their maleness? And if so, how? And if not, why not? Is male privilege granted or is it earned? Is it equally doled out or do different populations experience it in different ways? Those are just a few of the questions we're going to be looking at today. But before we dive into those, I am going to introduce some of the panelists. But quickly, just a very quick word of warning or a bit of a content warning. We don't envision necessarily talking about anything particularly difficult, but we may do, right? And if at any point you feel that any of the panelists or myself is discussing a topic which for you is uncomfortable or difficult, please, please, please engage in this session in a way which prioritizes your wellness. And if that means taking a step back, if that means disconnecting, that is absolutely fine. Your wellness is paramount. And with that, I'm going to go across to our wonderful panelists, and I'm going to go first to Tate. So please, Tate, introduce yourself, tell us your pronouns and the bits of you that are interesting and important for today's discussion.
Sure, thank you, Alex, and thank you to everybody for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. My name is Tate Smith. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm an open and proud transgender man. I work as a legal secretary, trans activist, and speaker. I frequently collaborate with Recreate Space, delivering panels such as these, and I also do lunch and learns on my own where I talk about the trans male lived experience.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tate. Next, I'm going to go over to Calvin.
Hi, thank you, Alex. My name is Calvin. I identify as a Black, gay, cisgendered male. My pronouns are he, they, and that's kind of been a journey for me over the last year or so because there have been times where I felt that I wasn't male enough. And that often led to situations where I was being dismissed or maybe victimized. So what I've decided to do is kind of like embrace there's parts of me and kind of like, yeah, embrace it as part of myself. So that's kind of where I stand with the he, they. All of my identities are important to me. Depending on the circumstance or the situation, they might take preference or a different hierarchy, but they're all important and serve me differently in different circumstances.
I love that. Code switching. We know it well. Thank you so much, Calvin. And last but certainly not least, Ryan.
Thanks, Alex. My name is Ryan Zayman. I'm a model, a writer, and a disabilities advocate, and I am a white cisgendered man, and I use the pronouns he, him.
Fabulous. See, I told you we had a good panel. I wasn't lying, right? We have three really, really amazing people. Great speakers, great thinkers. So the first question, and I'm going to throw this to you first, Ryan, but this is for everyone. And this is the big one, right? This is the topic. What is your relationship to male privilege? And do you feel like you benefit from it?
I do feel like I benefit from it, especially in work scenarios. And I tend to work a lot with women, maybe, and maybe I'm a man in a minority of a women-dominated profession. So I do think I do benefit from male privilege in some ways. But in other ways, I would say that my masculinity and maybe my male privilege in myself is brought into question. That's in two ways, really, because I have a physical disability. So that is something that constantly questions my masculinity, and I have internalized thoughts about that. But also, as all of us can relate to here, being part of the LGBTQ plus community as well, also kind of encourages internalized thoughts around masculinity and male privilege because of what society tells us about ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that also speaks to, I guess, what some people would call a traditional version of masculinity, right? A version of masculinity which is excluding or exclusive, dependent on whether you possess certain qualities or do not possess certain qualities. Calvin, coming to you, do you relate to that? What is your relationship to male privilege?
Yeah, I definitely relate to what Ryan has said. I definitely benefit from male privilege. How could I not? You know, for the most part, because of my build and how I present, I am read as male. So for in most situations, that would afford me a certain amount of privilege, like walking down the street alone and not having to be concerned with some of the things that women have to be concerned about. On the other hand, masculinity has often served as a cage for me or a barrier to my authenticity or my authentic self. I remember one of my earliest memories was as a child was playing with my female cousin with some dolls that she had brought and being told that boys don't play with dolls. I didn't understand why. They were just toys for me at the moment, you know, in the moment. And I think that for me kind of started this this hypervigilance of how I presented and was I performing my masculinity the way that people expected. So yeah, my relationship with male privilege is I think complicated, and it changes in various circumstances.
Thank you. And I think, yeah, there's something there around queerness of masculinity and how queer people experience masculinity in perhaps a slightly different way. Tate, do you have a contribution towards that? I feel like you may.
Sure. I feel like as soon as I transitioned 3.5 years ago, I immediately benefited from male privilege, which was a really interesting experience. And, you know, nothing I'd thought about before. I was so concentrated on the physical effects of what testosterone was going to bring. And I didn't realize that actually just me simply being male presenting was going to give me this privilege. And it was almost immediate. I mean, entering spaces with other men, whether it be shops, you know, an off license, a taxi, a barber's, you know, there's that immediate level of respect that I didn't have when I was presenting female, because when I would enter a space, you know, female presenting, you've got that 5-second, are you attractive or not assessment being done. But whenever it's a man entering another male space, it's like, you're right, mate, how are you? They immediately want to know how you are, how I'm doing. And more times than often, they tell me the whole life story. They want to be my best mate. And that was really, really interesting to me, because I used to experience catcalling. I used to be in fear of walking to the shops late at night and hearing a man's footsteps behind me. Now I find myself crossing the road so that girls don't feel that way when I'm walking behind them. I mean, I'm only small, I'm gonna mean absolutely like no harm to them, but the fact they see a man walking behind them scares them. So it's made me more in tune to the male experience, but it's been really, really interesting being on different sides of that privilege.
Yeah, and it strikes me listening to all three of your contributions that, you know, all three of you experience maleness in a slightly different way, where there's some other part of you that kind of interacts with that maleness in a way which kind of gives you a particular experience. And I'm curious to know whether you feel as a result of that, and it's not necessarily a tension, right? It's more an interrelationship between, for example, I can say, for example, being someone who's racialized, being someone who's brown, and being someone who's male, there's a particular kind of tension there in the eyes of other people, right? Not necessarily in the eyes of me. Do you feel like as a result of these sort of two things rubbing up against each other, that your masculinity has ever been questioned? And if so, how has that felt and how have you navigated that? I'm going to go back to Tate first.
Sure. So for me, I don't define my sexuality. I mean, I'm more attracted to people, but I find that my masculinity is questioned because of that. And another thing that I noticed after transitioning is just these small of questions, you know, why don't you go to the gym? Oh, you should stop just going on long walks. You need to work out, you know, now you're taking testosterone. There's these ideals of masculinity being put on me. Are you going to play football now? Are you going to get with loads of girls? Like proper lad culture. And I've been questioned as well because of how masculine I am. So when I date girls, there's no comments about my masculinity at all. I mean, there's compliments, you know, oh, I wouldn't have known you was trans. But I've actually had some men say to me on dates, I didn't realize you would be this masculine. Can you tone it down a little? Can you speak with a more feminine voice? Because that's how I thought you were going to be. And that's when I find my masculinity is questioned most of all. I mean, it's, as you can imagine, being trans, that's really difficult for me to navigate, because my masculinity is something I'm really, really proud of. I spent years thinking of what sort of man I was going to become. But, you know, I just have to laugh it off, because some of the comments can be pretty silly, but nonetheless, it's still harmful and upsets you.
Yeah, and I guess not only is your masculinity being questioned in those examples, but it's also being policed, right? It's someone is projecting onto you their idea of what masculinity should be, and because you're deviating from that, you're being told to be different. I'm going to go to Calvin next around this question. Have there been times when masculinity has been questioned?
Yeah, I think, you know, every male, there comes a point where their masculinity is questioned. I think particularly for queer men or gay men, we have learned to kind of like use our identities as kind of levers to navigate different circumstances. So like Ryan, I work in a mostly female sector, and usually white females, and I'm usually the only Black male. And so I usually would play up my femininity or my sexuality as a way to make me seem less of a threat, right? On the flip side, if I'm walking, through London at night by myself, I'm going to like muster up every type of, male bravado I can in order to get him safely. So I think more than challenged, I think my challenges have caused me to kind of like think about situations and try to mitigate what might happen so I feel safe or I can get through a situation safely.
Which makes a lot of sense, right? Safety is a priority, makes a lot of sense. Ryan.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to what both Calvin and Tate have said, especially what Tate said around kind of physicality. That's something that I can really relate to with my relationship with masculinity as someone who has a physical disability and was born that way. So it's kind of shaped me. And I think that there's a lot of questions, isn't there? And we were talking just before this call started a little bit about how people in the queer community especially can kind of code switch to change the way that they are acting around people to maybe be more listened to or reacted to in the right way. And I think that's something that I experience also as a bi person. And I think depending on who I'm facing, the kind of gender roles that I occupy or the kind of spaces with my temperament that I occupy, especially linking it to my disability changes. So for example, if I am with women, I'm more willing to accept help from less willing to accept help from someone physically if I needed help with something. Whereas with, like, if I was with men, I probably would. But also at the same time, I think in the queer community, there is a lot based around physicality, especially like men facing men and dating and all that kind of stuff. So it's all a bit of a minefield.
It certainly is. I can relate to that. You kind of sort of prompted my next question, Ryan, which is wonderful. But we've been talking a lot about, obviously, we are all people on this call, or at least who are speaking, that identify as LGBTQ plus in some degree or in some way. And I was kind of curious, we've been talking a lot about the specifics of what it means to be male, sort of inside the queer community and outside the queer community, sort of in our workplaces. But one thing that strikes me around the conversation of male privilege is that we don't always have the conversations that we need to have within the community about male privilege, right? We don't always, I think we are such a diverse group of people and we're not always taking into account that male privilege pervades our spaces, right? A good example would be the fact that when it comes to nightlife in London, you're citing London as a place, there are many, many, many more nightlife spaces that cater to gay men than that cater to lesbian or bisexual women, right? So these are themes that sort of pervade our lives as queer people, and that's obviously maybe a more fanciful example, but why do you think that is? And what do you think are some of the specific conversations that we could be having as queer people within our specific parts of the community to remedy that? I'm going to go to Calvin.
I think that's a good question. It's a lot to unpack. I think when we're thinking about privilege, we kind of have to interrogate the interlocking power structures that give those privileges, right? So where did they come from? Who created them, right? So for instance, today we're talking about male privilege. So what's the power structure that gives men privilege? That would be patriarchy. But this system is also upheld by like racism and capitalism and heteronormative and all these other systems of oppression. So if we understand that, then we have to understand that patriarchy does not give all men the same level of privilege, right? And I think that's a really important conversation to have. So gay men, Black men, men of color, trans men, men with disabilities, we kind of fall, we're not given the same privilege. And also, we also have to have the discussion that sometimes patriarchy upholds white women, right? And gives them a status. We can see that throughout society. For example, it's no coincidence that we've had 3 white female prime ministers, but no people of color, let alone a male, right? So I think it's about understanding like how people are given privilege and how people are like kept out of that privilege. So as a Black man, my privilege disappears when I'm stopped by a police officer because of generations of dehumanization and marginalization. I think it's also easier to see certain groups, specifically Black men, as perpetrators. And it's also harder to give them the privilege of being seen as a victim. Being seen as a victim is a privilege. And Black men aren't often given that privilege, even in death, as we've seen, through news stories throughout. So I think it's a very complicated discussion to have, but I think we really have to interrogate where the power comes from, where the privilege comes from, and who actually created it.
That was a wonderful answer. And I really related to, and also I think there's something very powerful in talking about privilege as something which is institutional and structural, but also something which can be given and can be taken away, right? Depending on the context. And I think that sort of more complex and nuanced idea of what privilege is incredibly useful when you're thinking about how different people can kind of shapeshift into different, we don't talk about code switching, can shapeshift into different roles, and depending on those roles can experience privilege or indeed not experience it. Big question, but Tate, I'm going to go over to you. Same thing. Do you need to repeat it because it was a big question?
Well, I was just going to say, I don't know if I can follow that up. That was fantastic. But thank you for mentioning the levels, Calvin, like much appreciated. But just from my perspective as a trans man, I think the issue here is making other trans men aware of this privilege as well. Because what I found interesting is when I try and talk about male privilege with some trans men I've interacted with, not generalizing and saying all, but they said, no, I don't have male privilege. I don't have that at all. And then when I've talked about, the walking home late at night, those examples that I gave, earlier, they then realize. So I think most of the problem is actually creating that discussion and recognizing that it does impact you, and not, just recognizing it is enough. You don't need to make a big hoo-ha out of it, and it doesn't need to be bad and affect you in any way. What's important is that, like we're doing now, we're creating that space to discuss it, and we're being aware of it and educating others about it.
100%. I'm going to go slightly off script, but I would actually be really curious to hear from all of you of an experience you may have had where you feel like you experienced male privilege, but it wasn't an obvious experience. Because it strikes me sometimes when we're having this conversation that there are some obvious ones, right? There are some obvious things that I think as men, many of us do have a level of self-awareness around. So for example, I know in a work meeting, I'm not going to get interrupted as much as a man because because it is what it is, right? Because of the patriarchy. But I'm curious if any of you have any examples of times when you've experienced male privilege and it's, either it's been pointed out to you or it's taken you a second to realize that what you're actually experiencing was a form of male privilege, because it might be useful. And people in the chat, if you have examples as well, please feel free to jump in. But I think sometimes in expanding on these definitions, we kind of bring people in a little bit more. Do either of you or any of you have any immediate thoughts? Ryan.
I've got one. So if you don't know, I'm a massive petrol head. And I think a great example of what you were trying to just outline there is me as a man going into a car garage and kind of knowing a little bit about how cars work and what might be wrong and what needs to be kind of rectified if something is wrong. And I've spoken to many friends who are women who are also into cars as equally as I am and probably know more than I do. But when they talk to mechanics, they're treated totally differently. And mechanics and engineers kind of act like these women don't know what they're talking about. And they could be an owner of a race car team and they still get spoken about or to like they don't know anything about cars at all because it's perceived to be more of a masculine, I guess, field and interest.
I think it's a great example. Calvin or Tate, do you have any ideas?
I have one. You reminded me one of that just then, Alex. I mean, as a legal secretary, that's stereotypically been a very female-dominated job. But yeah, you've just reminded me of when I started this job in February, and I brought up an idea for a policy in a meeting, and a woman said near enough exactly the same thing, but I got like oh my God, Tate, that was such an incredible idea. And it took me a bit, and I'm so glad that I went, no, but she said the exact same thing. So I found that as a legal secretary, and like even when I started my career presenting female, I used to just get shouted at by lawyers, even if I'd given work they'd asked for, printing they'd asked for, you know, what you doing in my room? Get out, silly girl, they'd say to me. Now, when I enter the room and given work they've requested from me, it's like, oh, male legal secretary, I'd say, you know, I want to get to know me.
I mean, a great example, great in that it's salient, not great as in that it's awful, but a useful example. There you go, Alex. Calvin, anything from you, and it's okay if not.
I guess the one thing that I often feel like I'm hyper vigilant around privilege, what privilege I hold and stuff like that. But one of the things that I often see a lot of is when I'm out walking on the street and it might be an empty street and it might be a female in front of me, just making sure that I am not walking up on them or that they know that I'm behind them. You know, I don't want to frighten them, but that's I'm going to say, but that's a mixture of male privilege and also hypervigilance that I'm a Black male, right? So I don't want to scare somebody because I'm a big Black male as well. So I think for me, those things are quite intertwined, and it's hard to separate them.
Yeah, I relate to that. I agree. Brilliant. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what's holding us all back, right? Because it seems like maybe not in this panel, but also maybe in this panel, I think we're quite a self-reflective bunch. You know, there are lots of people, queer people, and queer men, I would say, of course, who are being held back in terms of their understanding of male privilege, right? They benefit from all these privileges. And I think there's a little bit of a, maybe a misunderstanding sometimes that we think that being queer or being gay or being bi and being a man, those combination of things means that you can't possibly benefit from male privilege because for so much of your life, for many queer men, maleness has been something which they didn't feel like they could access, or they felt like they weren't quite a part of in the way that they wanted to be, or that society demanded that they be. So my question is, and I'm going to go to Ryan on this, what do you think is holding back queer men or gay and bi men from understanding their male privilege better?
And you're probably going to say this is an obvious answer, communication. We've all spoken about on this call so far how we all kind of have different intersections with our queerness or our interactions, excuse me, with the LGBTQ plus community. And we spoke about how there's levels of privilege with those intersections and what that means as far as masculinity. But to take us into the matrix, there's also levels within those levels of privilege. Sorry for the rubbish analogy, everyone. There's like 90 people.
Not at all.
They're probably all cringing. And like for me, let's use me as an example. I have a physical disability, but I also hold privilege within that because I'm relatively mildly affected by my disability compared to other people with my condition. And that's just my condition. There's hundreds of conditions out there. And I'm sure that Calvin, you yourself can relate that to your experience with race as well. And Tate can also relate that to their experience as a trans person. And yeah, communication is key, and we all need to speak to each other to understand that it is incredibly complicated and it isn't simple, and everyone does have privilege on this spectrum that is infinitely variable, I would say.
100%. I think communication is enormously important. And I think it's important to, just to build on your point, and Tate and Calvin, I'm going to go to you on this as well, if you do have any thoughts, but it's communication that obviously needs to happen, but it can't be at the expense of someone who, for example, might just be trying to live their life, right? I think particularly in the workplace, the next conversation is going to be about work, because that's a big part of all of our lives. You know, I have had experiences where people have been curious of wanting to understand certain aspects of who I am, whether it me being a queer man, whether it me being someone who's a person of color, an immigrant. And although sometimes I'm really happy to have those conversations and to communicate, it also can sometimes come at the expense of me trying to get my work done, right, or my job done. So there's an element of communication, but there's that nuance, right, of making sure that we communicate, but we communicate in a way which prioritizes each other's well-being, and that we check in with each other about whether we have the time to communicate about our maleness in that particular moment. Calvin, Tate, any thoughts on this? What do you think is holding us back as queer men from really deepening this privilege, and also, I guess, acting, right, to rectify it, or to kind of, you know, work against it or work with it and make the world a better place?
Sure, I think one of the things that you talked about was about taking care of other people's well-being. And I think when we're talking about privilege, we have to have a conversation of intersectionality, right? And a lot of people kind of like push away from intersectionality because it feels like, you know, you're putting people in groups and boxes and stuff like that. And I kind of don't see intersectionality like that. I kind of see intersectionality as understanding one individual and everything that impacts on them, and understanding their story and how can we help them. And I think sometimes people aren't wanting to kind of like lean into the differences or the similarities of our stories. And therefore we aren't able to lead with empathy. And we're still like, you know, kind of leading with division and stuff like that. So I think, yeah, that's what I'd say is one of the things that we're probably missing. Yeah.
Amazing. I want to talk a little bit about work. So as I said before, it's a big part of all of our lives, I imagine. And, you know, so often these conversations do play out at work, sometimes not always in the ways that we would like to, right? As queer men, we don't get to necessarily work with a group of other queer men, right? You know, Ryan and Calvin, you were both talking about being in sort of female-dominated spaces, and particularly, I imagine, white female-dominated spaces. And so, you know, we're not always around people who share our experiences, which is a good thing. But there's also space for us to, as a result, have conversations around privilege and our privileges that we hold and the other privileges that other people may hold, et cetera, et cetera. So my question is, and this is our last question, and by the way, if you have any questions, we are going to go to a Q&A after this. Please do pop them in the Q&A box. I've got a couple already, which I'm very excited to jump into. But how can we have better conversations about privilege, and particularly male privilege, at work? And also, why should we? I think that's kind of obvious, but I'm going to let you answer it anyway. I might go to Tate first.
I would just kind of follow the example that I did, you know, speaking up, you know, because I've seen somebody's put in the chat or Q&A about, you know, how can we flip the head on privilege? And I guess, you know, for what I've done with mine is by bringing attention to it, but also speaking up. No, she said something as well. Let's give her the voice. I think that's really, really important in a workplace, just speaking up for others in general.
100%, in a very simple way, right? Ryan, how about you?
I'm going to answer the why should we part first. I think if we look at all work we do, no matter what sector we work in, everything is a collaboration with other people. And I think that's reason enough in itself to need to talk about these things, to understand each other better. And I also think that's important when we think about decision-making powers in the workplace, coming up with solutions to problems in the workplace, and also allowing different perspectives to come to the fore, because that will ultimately mean that people are included and people are heard when they're spoken to, and that's what inclusion is, and that's what we all strive to be better at.
Calvin, how can we have better conversations around privilege at work, and why should we have those conversations?
Sure. So I'm probably going to do the why first as well. I think, like, to be honest, work often replicates the same power structures that we see in society, right? So we have to kind of like, so that's the reason why we should have these conversations around privilege, to kind of like dismantle these power structures. How can we have these better conversations? I think having the conversations is a first step, is really good. I think taking the time and creating the space to have those conversations. I also think it's really important that we interrogate where privilege is held in every situation, in every meeting that we're in, because it actually may surprise you, right? It doesn't always follow what we think it might be, right? I think also understanding our privilege in every situation, and what can we do to be allies in those situations? Are we going to hold somebody up? Are we going to speak on their behalf? Like, what are we willing to do to kind of like, to be an ally? And also recognizing when we're not the best place to be an ally, and what can we do to facilitate that, right? So it might not be our place, but we might need to facilitate somebody else to be an ally in that situation. And what can we do? So I think it's always like, for every situation, just understanding and interrogating where privilege is.
Yeah, and acknowledging that for many of us, particularly those of us who benefit from male privilege, we may not have had to do that before around our maleness, right? And recognizing that there is an extra level of, I guess, energy that requires, but actually there's that classic phrase which I'm about to butcher. It's like, when you're used to when you're used to privilege, equality feels like oppression. I did butcher it, but it's the same kind of thing, right? It's like, when you have these privileges, when you're a man or you're male identifying, and you've never really had to sit and really deep what it means to be a man in certain situations, it can feel like extra hard work. But actually, there are many women out there who have been doing that work for a long time, right? And who have had to do that work and who've not had a choice. So I think acknowledging that, and I think also recognizing that you won't always get it right, is really, really important. I have had many circumstances in which I've really tried. I've been thinking, I'm like, oh, Alex, smashing it, ally to all women. And then I say something wrong, or I interrupt someone, or I'm patronizing, I don't mean to be. And then I, collect myself, and I recognize that it's a process. Being an ally is a process. Wonderful contributions. And I think we're going to head over to our Q&A. Malis, am I coming to you, or am I doing the Q&A, or are we doing it together?
Well, we could do it together. I mean,
I just like
it. Let's do it. Thank you so much for all of you sharing and just bringing your thoughts in the chat. I'm just going to start, Alex, with this one question that came through, going back to Tate actually saying that we haven't heard from him around that what's missing piece from our community dealing with privilege. So Tate, what's missing?
I think somebody highlighted exactly what I was thinking in the chat, which is that people get very defensive about it, and they think they're going to lose the privilege. And I think we've had so much fantastic discussion about how we can, yes, acknowledge that privilege, but take that power and put it elsewhere. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, don't be scared to let some of it go. Let it go. That's the whole point. You know, we don't want to keep all of this. We want to put it to good use.
Thanks for that take. Alex, do you want to take the next one?
Sorry, I stole your job, Melis. I just like doing questions. I have a question here, which is, have you or can you give advice on how you have helped others to realize they're using or leaning on their male privilege in a negative way, which I think is actually a really good question. Anyone in particular have any examples of that when you've been like, mate, that's not okay?
I think anytime I hear a man mansplaining, that really annoys me. Like in a workplace setting, you know, like new parents do. I think when they hear about other new parents, they'll try and over explain and make it out like they're the god of parents and they know everything. And I saw that a man was trying to do this to an expecting mother. You know, oh, you shouldn't be breastfeeding at this point, you should be buying this, you should be buying that. And I was kind of like, okay, I don't really think it's your place. Like as a parent or as a man, it really, really irritates me when I see mansplaining. I don't think there's any need for it. So that's the only sort of time I've called it out, apart from, you know, getting women to speak up in, you know, board meetings and such and things like that.
I've also had similar situations to you where I've said something, or a woman has said something and I've repeated it. And then when I have repeated it, it's been heard, right? Yeah. And recognizing in that moment that you can actually choose to stop and say, whoa, hold up, Melis said that, right? Mm-hmm. I just repeated what Melis was saying rather than just continue the conversation is also really powerful. Ryan or Calvin, Ryan, go for it.
I can go first if that's all right, Calvin. Cool. Yeah, so like me and Calvin have discussed, we both work in kind of female dominated professions. And with me working in like fashion and creative, a lot of the spaces that I work in, people work very closely together physically and in open spaces. There's not really any like division in a photo studio where people can go and talk at a water machine or head into the toilets for a minute. You're all just kind of plopped there in the same space. And I think there's been multiple examples before where I've been the only other guy in the room, compared to someone who might have authority. It might be me as the only other guy and then the other male in authority. And then I've just had to turn around and kind of take the guy aside and be like, look, I'm the only other guy in the room and I've seen all these women, like their faces change and then go quiet because something that you said or you've done. And I just need you to acknowledge that and maybe change the way that you behave going forward so that doesn't happen again.
I like that. That's a great example. It's also a useful example because I sometimes think when we're talking about these moments of allyship or of, you know, when we're talking about these moments of allyship, sometimes it can feel like you have to say something in the moment and you have to enter into conflict. And actually a really underrated form of allyship, I think, is taking that person aside, right? And having a conversation, maybe not in the moment, sometimes if it's not appropriate, be like, hey, you did this thing. And Calvin.
The situation that comes to my mind is anytime anyone criticizes a Black woman, just because of all of the criticism that they get, all of the unfair treatment. So just always having to stand, or just wanting to stand up and lift up Black women. I think it's something that I try and do as often as possible.
Great. Melis, I'm going to volley back to you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I'm going to go to this piece here, and someone saying, I think it's really important to make the point again and again that acknowledging privilege doesn't mean that you've had it easy or never had to struggle. And as you've all highlighted just by telling your story, so how do we help people see the value of acknowledging it. And it's a really good question because someone else mentioned in that chat whether privilege is something that should be eliminated. Really interesting. So who wants to take that one first?
I can go first, but I hope people can follow. I agree with Dante that it is really important to acknowledge things that we are privileged in, as well as the things that we also struggle with. And I think that if we do that, then that is a credit to us as being self-aware as human beings, and can help positively affect the environments that we occupy. And how do we help people see the value of acknowledging it? That's the difficult part. Some people, you might not be able to change their minds, but I think part of acknowledging and being self-aware is knowing that you have differing opinions on things to other people. And if you can have an open conversation around whether it be privilege or something else that you might differ on in opinion or perspective, then that's half the battle, right? And having the dialogue, and maybe causing someone else to maybe not change their mind, but at least consider another point of view.
I think often when I've spoken about seeing the value in recognizing male privilege, I've spoken about, well, listen, it's really good to know both sides of the coin. It makes you a better person being aware of these things and educating yourself. And ultimately, you're making the world and the experience for women better because you're aware of not walking behind them so close, you know, crossing the road, making sure they're safe, speaking up for them in spaces like Ryan's mentioned where they've been made to feel uncomfortable. That's the value there, that you're making people's lives easier and their experience of day-to-day life better.
I guess for me, my approach would be, it's okay to acknowledge both sides of the coin, right? When we do have privilege, when we don't have privilege. And I think by recognizing when we have privilege and when we don't have privilege, and understanding that everybody has two sides to the coin, then it makes us more, I guess it gives us that empathy again to want to see when other people have privilege and when they don't have privilege, and how we can help. Because if we remember that we don't have privilege at times and we would like for that help, means that when we do have privilege, I would hope it would mean that when we do have privilege, that we're more likely to help out.
Alex?
I'm liking this double act. I could get used to this, Melis. So I've got a question here, which I think is quite a good one. It's taking us out of the context of work and also of maybe being in the queer community. And the question is, has anyone got any advice around tackling male privilege within family or in the home space? Which I think for many of us is a very activating space. I can at least speak for myself. A really good question. Any thoughts on how those kind of maybe intergenerational nuances can impact trying to unpack your male privilege?
I would just say putting boundaries in, because I think my experience in a family setting has always been the whole man of the house thing, and that as a man you have to assume that role and be the one that catches spiders, that if an intruder broke in, you would be the one to deal with it, and all of that responsibility is put on you, especially if you're in a single parent family, or maybe you're the only person that works and you happen to be male and you're expected to kind of be the breadwinner. It's having those discussions like, okay, I know that all these gender roles and stereotypes are going to be put on me because I'm the man of the house as per se, but I don't actually feel comfortable with this. Actually, can we just share this out amongst us? Actually, can we unpack this and talk about the impact this is going to have on me long term? Because actually I bring something a lot more to our family.
Calvin or Ryan, do you have any thoughts?
I was brought up in a household full of boys, so I don't think I'm the best person to answer this question.
Well, I mean,
That's
it's
what-
interesting though, right? Like being brought up in a household full of boys, I imagine that, do you talk about your male privilege in a household full of boys, or is it not a topic that is even mentionable because it's not something which anyone would have the space to talk about?
I think I definitely talk about with the male members of my family now that I'm more grown up and aware of it. But as I was growing up and in that family setting, I guess I kind of vaguely understood it, as a lot of young people do, but I don't think I was mature enough and aware enough to fully understand what might be going on. And of course, 10, 15 years ago, when I was a child, is very different to what a child of that age is going through now. And I hope it's a lot better than it was when I was growing up.
Calvin, sorry to have interrupted.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I grew up in a house full of guys as well, and a single mom. I so I guess for me, it's like, I guess I would encourage people to kind of like show people how the male privilege can either bring about negative behaviors, like because we're kind of encouraging things that we don't, that we don't even like to see, and how our parents, single moms or moms, also replicating or facilitating that male privilege, right? I think coming from a house full of boys, I wouldn't say that I necessarily, even within that group, even within my brothers, I had less male privilege because of how I presented. I didn't quite fit into the realm of maleness like they did. They are very much sporty and all of that type of stuff. And being able to be nurtured, I guess, would be something that I would probably advocate for, that like allowing boys to be who they are, allowing, it's kind of why I wore this shirt, boys get sad too, right? Allowing boys to have emotions and to feel and stuff like that. I think is really important to dismantle male privilege or to challenge it.
And to encourage the emotions, right?
Yeah,
to also proactively encourage emotions in boys, because I think we're all, and this is the thing about the family environment, is that our family environment for all of us has contributed to, our first ever male relationship. For those of us who had a father around, was a father, right, or a brother. And so these are, we project these images onto the rest of the world as we go through it. So I think it's a very important topic. Melis, I'm gonna pull you back to you with a few minutes left.
Yes, about feeling, and I was going to say the first, or one of the most important times where I witnessed male privilege being kind of broken down was my own dad, when he decided to say, do you know what, forget this me being the head of the family thing, I'm just going to be a human being, and actually just broke down and talking about his own vulnerability and crying and talking about his mistakes. And I think that really set a different frame even for my brother. And for the people around who never thought that, this African man and dad could ever, create space for others to join him and meet him in terms of an emotional sense. So that was profound. Quick fire round before we wrap up, everybody. There's a last question there that says, do you think there's anything that needs to be done differently to create psychological safety for men? I think we touched in on that, but maybe closing in on some quick points.
I would just say validating each other, men's thoughts and feelings. It's okay to share. And I think that's ultimately what psychological safety net would be, that you can talk about these things, and this is the safe space in which you can do so.
I think I like that example that you gave about your father dismantling male privilege. And I think that intergenerational process is really important, like older men working with younger men to kind of like dismantle these systems and show them that there's another way. And I think that does help create and foster emotional maturity and emotional safety.
And I would say that men should go with their gut and think that if the person they're speaking to is someone that they could trust, then you should speak to them and open up. You don't need to be closed off all the time and worried about what other people think, because just like everyone else, men need to release their emotional energy too.
Alex, anything you want to add?
And world peace. No, I'm just kidding. I think, no, I think, well, to wrap up, I think there's something about men uplifting other men, right? Like there are men in my life who are way less emotionally expressive than I am. And I am constantly making a concerted effort to give them space as much as possible and to encourage them to share their emotions, even when I don't think they want to, or it makes them uncomfortable. And that's me using my privileges as someone who's queer and who I think has been forced to reckon with my masculinity in ways that many of my perhaps not queer, I was gonna say less queer, everyone is queer, not queer friends have. So that's what I do. I create opportunities for those conversations as much as possible. Sometimes they don't work, sometimes they do. That's the way that it is. Yeah.
Beautiful. On that note, thank you so much, Alex, for just expertly moderating this, and Calvin, Ryan, and Tate, just such an incredible conversation. As we've seen in the chat, there's so much that was coming through, and really appreciate everybody who shared. We'll be back next month again with another conversation. This time we'll be exploring, well, how we dismantle, even just break down the monolith that is often kind of projected on this identity of Blackness. So really bringing forward voices from all over the world who identify as Black, but have a variety of lived experience, also being queer, and exploring what that looks like. So we really hope you come through and again, bring your questions, inquire further, but that's it from us. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Okay. Thanks a lot, everybody. And
Have a
stay
great
safe.
day, everyone.
Thank
Have
you.
a great day. Bye.